Is Pope Francis really Pope? With all the things he has been saying and doing, he doesn't seem to have the faith. But how can someone who doesn't have the faith be the head of the church? Christ made St. Peter Pope precisely because of his faith when he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So if the Pope loses the faith, doesn't he cease being Pope? Welcome to another episode brought to you by the Fatima Center. I'm Father Albert, a traditional Dominican priest. Well, it's certainly true that Pope Francis is doing some things that make us question the fact of whether he is the Pope, and many people are asking that question. And some people answer it by saying, no, he's not. For example, Archbishop Vigano has come out to say that the Pope is not really the Pope. He's materialiter of the Pope, and not formaliter of the Pope, which means, in fact, he's not really the Pope. He's just filling the place while waiting for someone else to come and fill it, but he's not really the Pope. It's very important to know, especially in the present situation, that the theologians of the Church have discussed this question before about what happens if a Pope becomes a heretic. And they all have answered that it's not by the simple fact of becoming a heretic that he ceases to become Pope, that he ceases to be the Pope. It's not ipso facto, as we're going to see. So considering the vital importance of this question, we're going to go into it in depth. I'm going to simply summarize for you the treatment of this question by one of the great theologians of the Church, John of St. Thomas, who has the advantage of coming a little bit later than other theologians who discuss this, and so he summarizes their positions and reconciles them. So the precise question that he poses is the following: can the Pope be deposed by the Church as he is elected by her, and in which cases? So he starts by answering the question very simply. The response is that a Pope cannot be deposed, nor lose the papacy, unless two conditions concur. Namely, that the heresy not be occult, but public, and juridically notorious. Secondly, he must be incorrigible and pertinacious in heresy. Now that's a distinction in canon law between occult heresy and public manifest heresy. Occult heresy is a heresy that's known only to the person himself or to a few people around him. A public heresy is a heresy everybody knows. And if it's juridically public, that means that it's been declared to be public by some authority in the Church. And that's an important distinction, as we're going to see. So he mentioned the position of some theologians who said that occult heresy is enough to cause the automatic deposition of the Pope. But that's been abandoned by almost everyone because just by the practice of the Church, because occult heretics, for example, can absolve sins. And if you can absolve sins, that means you have authority, because to absolve someone from their sins, you have to have authority over them because it's a judgment. So the fact that occult heretics in the Church have always been recognized to be able to absolve sins, it means that the Pope, even if he's an occult heresy, he can still have authority in the Church, he can still be the Pope. So that position is quite generally abandoned today. It's interesting to read how he explains this. And the reason is because occult heretics, as long as they're not condemned and cut off, are parts of the Church and communicate with it by an exterior communication, although not by an internal spirit. So they don't have the faith, but they have this exterior communication. Therefore, also, if the Pope is an occult heretic, he is not thereby cut off from the Church. Therefore, he can still be its head, just as he is still a part and a member, although not a live member. That is, he doesn't have the charity, he doesn't even have the faith. This is confirmed by the fact that without faith, they can exercise acts of order and of ecclesiastical jurisdiction upon priests inferior to them. For a heretical priest can confect the sacraments and absolve in extreme necessity. Therefore, even faith is not required for a pope to exercise jurisdiction as long as he is not deposed by the Church. And he makes an important distinction here that applies, I think, today between the personal faith of the Pope and the common faith of the Church. The former faith of the Pope is not guaranteed, except insofar as it affects the common faith of the Church. And he explains. Thus, the authority of the Pope is founded on the true faith, not, however, on the personal faith of some person, and as anyone according to his own opinion might profess it, but rather on the common faith of the whole Church, in which the Pope cannot fail, in the sense that even if he be a heretic personally, nevertheless he cannot teach anything against the faith ex cathedra. In this faith, therefore, that is the faith of the chair, cathedra, of Peter and his confession, in this the papacy is founded, not in the personal faith, even of the person of the Pope. So that's very important. A true Pope cannot teach ex cathedra a heresy, but it has to be ex cathedra, that is by the full authority of the Pope. And if he's not doing that, he can be a heretic and even teach heresies, but he can't teach a heresy ex cathedra. And it's never happened in the Pope, and it's not happened in the history of the Church, and it hasn't happened even today. Pope Francis doesn't make a solemn declaration of these things that he's saying. He says some of these strange things in interviews, etc., but he's never said anything ex cathedra. It's not his style. John St. Thomason treats of the second condition required for the deposition of a pope. He must be incorrigible and pertinacious in his heresy. Well, he quotes here, as do all the authors, the authority of St. Paul, who says in his letter to Titus, chapter 3, verse 11, after the first and second admonition, avoid him, knowing that he that is such a one is subverted. Okay, so he's talking about a heretic. And John St. Thomas comments, since the apostle only prescribed that a heretic be avoided after a first and a second rebuke, therefore, if rebuked he repents, he is not to be avoided. Therefore, since the Pope must be deposed because of heresy in virtue of this apostolic precept, it follows from the same precept that if he is willing to be corrected, he must not be deposed. So this is the verse that's used in Scripture all the time, and the Seder Countess uses it all the time as well, for saying that someone who is a heretic must be avoided, but it's after a first and second admonition. So there have to be these admonitions of the Pope, well, by some authority, obviously, not by just anyone. And if he repents, well, then he's still Pope, because it's only after first and second admonition. And John of St. Thomas gives the example of Pope Marcellinus, who in fact had fallen into a heresy, and the bishops made a council and accused him of it, and he repented. He had resigned the papacy, but he became Pope again, and he became a martyr. So that's an obvious proof that if someone repents of being a heretic, well, he can remain Pope. John of St. Thomas then insists that the only reason for which a pope can be deposed is heresy, and he gives as his canonical text a text that everybody quotes all the time. It's called Si Papa, Distinction 40, a canonical text which explicitly states that a pope cannot be judged by anyone, because that's an adage that canonists quote all the time. The Pope is judged by no one. But Si Papa adds an important qualification, except in the case of heresy. The text reads, the faults of a Pope can be rebuked by no mortal unless he be discovered to be erring in the faith. And John of St. Thomas goes on to draw the consequences with regard to the modality of the deposition of the Pope because of his erring in the faith. He writes, therefore, the deposition of the Pope cannot be done directly by way of judgment or punishment, since he has no superior on earth by which he might be punished or corrected. Therefore, he can be deposed only by reason of the indisposition on his part to be head of the Church, namely because he is separated and segregated from her by abandoning the faith, in such a way that the Church must avoid him. And he insists on the fact that that's the only reason that the church can avoid the Pope, no matter how grave his other sins. Because, again, the Pope is judged by no one. And he goes on to explain how this even applies in the case of heresy. And neither is the Pope judged directly for heresy, because by divine law, the church is required to segregate itself from and not communicate with a heretic. Therefore, once the declaration has been made that he is a heretic, the church cannot regard him as her head, because it cannot communicate with him. Now, a head to which a body is not united with, and with which it cannot communicate, is not a head. So this last phrase gives the key principle for understanding how the deposition, which he will go on to explain presently, takes place. It's not a matter of exercising authority over the Pope, which is impossible because he has no authority over him on earth, but of having to separate oneself from him. Now, this must be remembered in the discussion which follows, because it will explain why it seems unnecessarily complicated. But it's because of this fundamental truth that no one can judge the Pope. So before going on to discuss this in detail, he repeats that heresy is the only reason that justifies separation from the Pope. And in the case of heresy, she must not treat him as Pope, as he's going to go on to explain. And he adds, however, that even before the separation, one can defend oneself against him. And in particular, he says, if he were to establish something against good morals, he is not to be obeyed, because an unjust law does not oblige. Well, obviously, that applies to certain things that the Pope has said, in particular with regard to divorce, remarried people, or even homosexual marriages, etc. If he were to establish something against morals, he's not to be avoided. That's very simple. Now, with regard to the deposition, the obvious problem is, as he says, by what authority this deposition of the Pope must take place. Now, there are two major questions here. The first is not too difficult and consists in establishing by what authority this deposition is going to take place. And he says it can only take place by a general council. In the history of the church, that's what's happened. He answers this question with a fundamental principle of common sense at the bottom of the whole question. That is, by what authority this is going to happen, because it's only the Pope who can convene a council. So how can you have a council that's going to depose the Pope without the Pope? Well, it's a matter of life and death in the church. And so that's why it can happen, because it must happen, he says. It is responded that this council can be called by the authority of the church, which is in the bishop themselves, or in the major part of them, because the bishops have divine authority in the church. It's underneath the authority of the Pope, but they do have divine authority, because bishops are part of the divine constitution of the church. Once a bishop is a bishop, he has divine authority. So, and then the only other ones in the church that have divine authority by their very position. Priests get it from the bishops. So they do have a divine authority in the church. For the church, so he says, this council can be called by the authority of the church, which is in the bishops, or in the major part of them. The church has the right to separate herself from a heretical pope by divine law, because that's what St. Paul says. And consequently, to employ all the means per se necessary to accomplish that segregation. If they have the right to do it, well, then they have the means to do it by divine law. Now, it is a medium necessary and per se that such a crime be juridically manifest. Now, that's very important against the state of vacantis. It's not just everybody singularly going to decide the Pope's a heretic. It has to be juridically manifest. However, it cannot be juridically manifest unless a competent judgment be formed. But in such a grave matter, there cannot be a competent judgment except by a general council, because it is a question of the universal head of the church. Thus, it pertains to the judgment of the universal church, which is a general council. This is why a pope cannot annul such a council or refuse it, because he himself is a party of the dispute. And the church, by divine right, has the power to call it for this purpose, because she has the right to separate itself from a heretic. He then treats of the second major question, namely, by whose authority this deposition takes place. Now, this is where there's some disagreement among theologians, but it's not a disagreement that's as major as some people think. Sedevacantist claim, in one way or another, that the Pope loses his papacy by the very fact of being a heretic. Whereas, as we shall see, that's not the position of any of the major theologians who treated this question. They all agree that there must be some intervention of authority at some point in the deposition of the Pope. It's something not decided by individual people on their own. They disagree on the precise nature of this intervention of authority, but they all agree that it's necessary and that it must happen. And until it happens, the Pope is still the Pope. Now, John of St. Thomas exposes the position of Cajetan, which he adopts as his own, which position is opposed to three other positions that Cajetan himself explains. One of them, well, there's two extreme positions. One of them says that by the very fact of being a heretic, ipso facto, the Pope is no longer the Pope. That's the position of the Sedevacantists. The other extreme is that it says, in fact, the Church has the power to judge the Pope. In between these two extreme positions, there's one that says, no, the Church does not have the power to judge the Pope, except in the case of heresy. Cajetan doesn't accept any of these positions. The one he takes is that even in the case of heresy, the Church does not have the authority to judge the Pope. He explains, neither absolutely nor for the case of heresy does the Pope have a superior power over him on earth, but only a ministerial power, just as the Church has a ministerial power to elect a Pope insofar as it designates the person who is the Pope, not, however, in such a way that it gives him his authority, because this comes immediately from Christ. Similarly, also in the deposition or the destruction of this conjunction by which the papacy is joined to this particular person, the Church has a ministerial power disposing him ministerially. Christ, however, can deprive him of his power authoritatively. So this is where the dispute takes place, on the fine point of how exactly the Church plays a role in the deposition of a heretical Pope. Bellarmine accuses Cajetan of saying that the Church is deposing the Pope, who is a manifest heretic, authoritatively, rather than in being so ipso facto by his heresy. Suarez claims that Cajetan says that the Church has authority over the Pope as a private person, not as he is the Pope. John of St. Thomas responds, Cajetan does not say this, but he says that the Church is not over the Pope absolutely, even in the case of heresy, but that she is over the conjunction of the papacy with this person by dissolving, in the way that she formed it, by the election, which power of the Church is ministerial. For Christ the Lord alone is superior to the Pope simpliciter. And thus Bellarmine and Suarez think that the Pope, by the very fact that he is a manifest heretic and declared incorrigible, is immediately deposed by Christ the Lord, not by any authority of the Church. So then, in the crucial part of his text, John of St. Thomas summarizes the position of Cajetan in three statements, and he defends them one by one, especially against Bellarmine and Suarez. The first statement, he writes, is that a heretical Pope, precisely by the fact of heresy, is not deprived of the papacy, nor is he deposed. Now, he proves this by the fact that before the two admonitions that St. Paul speaks of, the Pope is not deposed. For if he repents because of these admonitions, he cannot be avoided, nor consequently deposed. So the simple fact of being a heretic does not make him deposed. Now, this is the key passage, because it shows that the position of Cajetan and John of St. Thomas is not really different from what Bellarmine and Suarez say with regard to the final point of the necessity of an intervention of some authority in the deposition of the Pope. Because as John St. Thomas just said, Bellarmine and Suarez accept that the Pope, by the very fact that he is a heretic and declared incorrigible, is immediately deposed by the Lord. Therefore, their ipso facto doesn't exclude some declaration by some authority, namely the bishops, since they are the only divine authority in the church except for the Pope. Suarez, for example, writes, if the Pope is heretical and incorrigible, when first by the legitimate jurisdiction of the church a declaratory sentence of the crime is preferred against them, he ceases to be Pope. This is the common opinion of doctors which is gathered from Clement I in his first epistle, where he says that Peter taught that a heretical Pope must be deposed. And similarly, further on, he says, from whence it is clear that by divine right the Pope is deposed once the sentence of the church has been pronounced. Lata ecclesiae sententia. So there has to be a sentence of the church, according to Suarez. Now, Bellarmine doesn't go into much detail with Suarez, but he does say very clearly, with regard to the second opinion which he treats, which says that the Pope ceases to be Pope by the very fact of being a heretic. Well, he says, for me, this is not approved. This is not proved. For it is true that jurisdiction is given to the Pope by God. However, it is by the concurrent work of men, because it is from men that this man, who before was not Pope, begins to be Pope. Therefore, it is not taken away by God, except by men. But an occult heretic cannot be judged by men, therefore. So this is basically the same point made by Cajetan and John of St. Tim, the Pope. The papacy is not taken away by God, except by men. Now, obviously not by any man. It has to be someone who has authority to do so, namely the bishops. The second point of Cajetan's position, given by St. John of St. Thomas, is that even in the case of heresy, the church has no authority over the Pope, because Christ made him the sole head of the church. And we insist on this very strongly. He writes, no exception has been made by Christ the Lord in which this authority of the Pope is limited and is subjected to another. But always, and with regard to everything, he speaks of it as being supreme and monarchical. When he speaks of heresy, however, he does not attribute any authority over the Pope, but only commands to avoid and separate from and not communicate with the heretic, all of which does not indicate any superiority and can take place without it. Therefore, the authority of the Church is not superior with respect to the authority of the Pope, even in the case of heresy. And this is shown clearly by the laws which say that the first see is judged by no man, as we said before, which also applies in the case of infidelity, for the fathers congregated in the case of Pope Marcellinus said, you judge yourself. And finally, he gives the third statement, which is the full exposition of Cajetan's precise explanation of how this delicate but necessary operation of the deposition of a heretical Pope takes place in a way that does not violate the principle he just stated of the absolute independence of the power of the Pope with regard to any human power. He writes, the third statement is that the authority of the Church has as its object the application of the authority of the Pope to a person, designating him by election, and the separation of this authority from a person by declaring him a heretic and to be avoided by the faithful. So, the ministerial authority that the Church has in creating the Pope, by designating him as the person who receives the authority from Christ, is taken as the key to understand how she can depose the Pope without violating the principle that she can have any authority over him. For just as she did not give authority to the Pope, but rather simply designated by election the person to whom God gave it, so also she does not take away the authority of the Pope, but rather induces a disposition in him that is incompatible with that authority, from which follows God's action of taking away that authority. He goes on to explain, for the Church can declare the crime of a Pope and propose him to be to the faithful as someone to be avoided according to divine law, in virtue of which a heretic is to be avoided. Now, the pontiff to be avoided is necessarily rendered impotent in virtue of that disposition of being the head of the Church, because he is a member that must be avoided by it, and consequently he cannot have any influence over it. Therefore, by virtue of such a power, the Church dissolves in a ministerial and dispositive manner the conjunction of the with this person. And he explains, since the church can declare that the Pope must be avoided, she can induce a disposition in that person together with which the papacy cannot continue. And thus it is ministerially and dispositively dissolved by the church, but authoritatively by Christ. Just as by designating him by election, the church disposes him in an ultimate manner to receive the collation of authority from Christ the Lord, and thus ministerially creates the Pope. So this explains how the church can have a role in the deposition of the Pope without having authority over him. In fact, Cajetan and John of St. Thomas are saying nothing is really any different from Bellarmine and Suarez. They're simply explaining how it works. Bellarmine and Suarez say that the church has to declare the heresy of the Pope. And Cajetan and John St. Thomas show more precisely the role that the declaration plays. John of St. Thomas goes on. And when Cajetan says that the church has an authoritative power over the person's conjunction to or separation from the papacy, but a ministerial power over the papacy itself, it is to be understood in the sense that the church has the authority to declare the crime of the Pope, just as he has the authority to designate him as Pope. And what is authoritative with regard to the declaration is dispositive and ministerial with regard to the form that is to be joined or separated. For in the form absolutely and itself, the church can do nothing, because that power is not subordinated to it. And thus are concorded the laws which say, on the one hand, that the deposition of the Pope pertains to God alone, and on the other, in the case of heresy, he can be judged by his inferiors, for both are true. So he then answers the objections. We'll just look at the one of Bellarmine, where he says, for Bellarmine objects that the apostle says that a heretical man must be avoided after 2 admonitions, that is, after he appears manifestly pertinacious before any excommunication and sentence of a judge. As Jerome writes, because heretics per se leave the body, because St. John, or Bellarmine quotes a text of St. Jerome, where he says, ipso facto, the Pope is no longer the Pope, because of his heresy. Well, John of St. Thomas answers, we respond that a heretic is to be avoided because of 2 admonitions, that is, done juridically and by the authority of the church, and are not according to private judgment. For there would follow great confusion in the church if it sufficed for this admonition to be done by a private person, and that once the heresy was manifested, but not declared by the church and opposed by her to all that they avoid the Pope, all be held to avoid him. For the heresy of a Pope cannot be public for all the faithful unless by the report of others. This report, however, since it is not juridical, does not oblige all to believe it and avoid him. It is required, therefore, that just as the church, designating him to all, juridically propose him to be as being elected, similarly declaring and proposing him as a heretic to be avoided, she deposes him. Therefore, not by the very fact that the Pope is a heretic does she also publicly cease to be Pope before any sentence of the church, and before she proposes him to the faithful as one to be avoided. Neither does Jerome, when he says that a heretic per se leaves the body of Christ, exclude the judgment itself of the church in such a grave matter, as is the deposition of a Pope. But he judges the quality of the crime, which per se, without any other censure having been added, excludes one from the church. However, as long as it be declared by the church. So hopefully that's enabled you to understand a little better this very difficult but very current question of heresy of a Pope and what happens, what has to happen so that he's not Pope. Until that does happen, he continues to be the Pope, even if he's an explicit formal heretic. So I invite you to send your questions to the Fatima Center. Please also consider making a donation to the Fatima Center so that the apostolate may continue its mission of making the true message of Fatima known to everyone. May God bless you.